So you want to get into cryptocurrency mining with graphics card, aka GPU. And this is your very first time venturing into GPU mining or building your very own first GPU mining rig, and you do not know how to get started. Well, rest assured, because I'm going to come out with a couple of videos that are going to help you in this journey. And in this video, I'll be diving into the parts guide. I'll be listing all these parts that you need, how to choose these parts, and what are the things that you will need to consider while choosing the parts that you need. Which parts you can probably save some money and which parts you should not go cheap on, as well as some of the general recommendations based on my experience in GPU mining. Now, building a GPU mining rig is just like building a PC, but with many graphics cards attached to a single system, and the cases or frames that hold the components are different. It is usually either an open air case mining rig like this one or a server case. For this parts guide, I'll be discussing the parts list for an open air style mining frame, which is more popular and residential friendly, I would say, as mining with a server case requires you to use powerful fans that are designed for server and industrial purposes, and those fans are going to be a lot noisier. So without further ado, let's move into every single component that you would need. So let's start with a couple of parts that you can go as budget as possible, as long as they work and serve the purpose. The first few parts are the basic parts that you will need for every single PC build, and they are the motherboard, the CPU and the CPU cooler, the RAM, and also storage. Now, for the motherboard, what you will need to get is motherboard that have as many PCIe slots as you can, because this is going to determine how many GPU you can attach to a single rig. Usually we'll go for an RTX motherboard that has 6 PCIe slots. Now, some motherboards also have what we call the M.2 slot, which you can potentially also convert this into a PCIe slot, whereby you can add another GPU. After that, you can choose the cheapest motherboard that you can find, as long as they fulfill these criteria that I've just mentioned. You do not need motherboard that has like RGB or beefy VRM or CPU overclock capabilities. There are also mining motherboards that are designed specifically for mining, whereby it has an absurd amount of PCIe slots. Now, these motherboards can be a little bit pricey even if you get them used. And the more GPU you add into a single particular system, the more unstable the rig can become. So if you're just getting started, I would say stick with a maximum of like 6 to 8 GPU per rig. But if you are ambitious enough, you can go for those mining rigs like motherboards that have like 12 or even 19 PCIe slots. But again, granted, you can get them at a reasonable prices. So you will need to do some research on the pricing at your region. So since we have the motherboard, then we will need a brain for the system, aka CPU, or sometimes known as a processor. Now, for this, you can go as budget as you can, as long as the CPU is compatible with the motherboard of your choice. Now, we are not going to do CPU mining, so the CPU is not doing much jobs while we are mining with our GPUs. So for CPU, you just have to check the compatibility before grabbing one. Now, if you are using an Intel system, a Celeron processor will do. Now, there is no point getting like an i7 or i9, or those who are using the Ryzen system, there's no point to get Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9. Now, if your motherboard supports AMD like this one instead of Intel, then the Athlon CPU, which is this one, will get the job done. To cool down your CPU, you will of course need a CPU cooler. But since the CPU is not doing any heavy tasks, you don't need a beefy CPU cooler or AIO. In fact, the stock cooler that comes with the CPU is actually good enough. Now, if you get a used CPU that does not come with a cooler, basically any budget CPU cooler like this one right over here will actually get the job done. If you are getting an aftermarket CPU cooler, make sure to check the compatibility. Make sure you are getting the cooler that can support the CPU socket that you are using. Next, what you will need is a stick of RAM. Again, we are not doing any kind of like multitasking jobs with our mining rig, and the mining process itself does not require a lot of RAM. Now you can go by with 4GB of RAM if you are using a Linux-based operating system, but if you are going to install Windows instead of Linux-based systems, 8GB of RAM is recommended. Now you don't need any higher than this, and you don't need like fast RAM timing, and definitely you don't need fancy RGB like what I have shown here. Now just a stick of 8GB RAM, then you are good to go. The only thing is to ensure your RAM is compatible with your motherboard, and I don't think it would be an issue for most people, but it is good to mention here. At the point of recording this video, the motherboard that you are going to use is probably going to support like DDR4 RAM, but just in case you are getting an ancient motherboard that supports the DDR3 RAM, then you will need DDR3 RAM for the system to work. But if you can, try not to build a system that is that old. You might be facing like compatibility and stability issues down the road, especially with newer GPU. But it depends on availability, I would say. Those like budget value RAM like this is actually good to go, but if you are not able to find one, those RGB RAM like this one, whatever your budget fits, can also be used. Now, if you want to go really cheap on these parts, you can also use any old PC that you have lying around together with the CPU and CPU cooler or even the RAM. Now, you might have less PCIe slots as the standard PC or even pre-built out there are using the MATX motherboard, which have only like 2 to a maximum of 4 PCIe slots. But if you are just like getting started with only a few GPUs, like say 2 GPUs or 3 GPUs, you can use the motherboard as long as it is still functioning. Then you only need to think about upgrading the motherboard after you run out of PCIe slots. Now you can use PCIe Splitter card to possibly install more GPU into one rig, but there is no guarantee that the PCIe Splitter card will work on every system. You can give it a try, but understand that there is no guarantee that it will work. The next thing that you will need is a storage to store your operating system. For this, I recommend using SSD like this one, and they are pretty affordable nowadays. Now, you do not need large storage for this. A 64GB SSD will be more than sufficient, but it is quite tough to get, at least in my region. So I always go for the cheapest 120GB SSD that I can find. Now, if you are getting a used system that comes with the traditional spinning hard drive, you can get it to work, but I would highly recommend you to upgrade to an SSD. Now, you don't need high capacity hard disk to load the operating system, just the cheapest 2.5-inch SSD that you can find. And you definitely do not need high-speed M.2 NVMe SSD as well. Now, you can get the system to work with a USB thumb drive by installing the operating system into the thumb drive if you are using a Linux-based operating system. But for stability and longevity, an SSD is still recommended. Next, you will need something to mount all your parts and components, and we will be using an open-air mining frame just like this one. Okay, they come in a few varieties, and some allow you to install 6 GPUs, some are designed for 8 GPUs or more. And you can of course install and fit your motherboard, your other parts like power supply, graphics cards as well on the frame. So some mining rig frame can fit more than one power supply, while some can only support like a single power supply. But to me, this is not a major concern. You can just put your power supply like next to your mining rig, since you are not going to move your mining rig so often anyway. If you want to save some money in this department, you can actually build your own mining rig frame with aluminum angles or wood, especially if you already have access to those tools, or you can also buy a cheap like shoe rack and just like place the motherboard and power supply at the bottom level and zip tie your GPU at the upper level later. It will get the job done anyway, unless you have like kids or pets accessing your mining rig. And for most mining rig frames out there, you can install a few PC case fans on the rig. You might have also seen some mining rigs that have PC case fans on it, like this one that I've just shown you just now. Now, these fans are completely optional, especially when you have enough spacing in between your GPU. Now, based on my experience, they are more towards like aesthetically pleasing rather than functional, unless you are really spending a lot on great PC case fans. Now, great PC case fans with High CFMs are definitely going to reduce the temps of your GPU, but this will be an additional cost for you and they are quite expensive, especially if you go for grade ones like those from Noctuas. The cost will also add up very quickly. Now, if a fan costs you $30, 4 fans will have already cost you $120, and there are better ways to actually spend this money. A lot of time you are better off by putting your household fan right in front of your mining rig. If you want to optimize your budget, case fans would not be necessary. But I have to say, nice case fans do make mining rigs look cool. You might also find some fans that are advertised to have high CFM and designed for mining specifically. Now, oftentimes these are fans that they are a lot noisier and designed for industrial purpose like server case. Now, this one is actually a Delta fan. It's very noisy. So if you are not putting your GPU mining rig at home and you are desperate for some airflow, for example, you do not have adequate spacing between your GPUs are getting hotter and you need some airflow, then this fan will definitely get the job done. Just that the noise level is definitely not going to be residential friendly. The next two parts are going to be parts that I highly recommend you to keep a couple of spares on hand, and they are the PCIe splitters and also PCIe risers. PCIe riser is the component that you will need in order to connect your GPU to your system without directly attaching it onto the motherboard. Now, obviously, you cannot cram multiple GPUs onto a single normal motherboard like this one unless you are going with riserless motherboards that are designed specifically for GPU mining. But personally, I prefer my parts to have better exit plan. If I were to quit GPU mining one day, I can sell my normal RTX motherboard to anyone who is looking into getting a PC. But I cannot sell a riserless motherboard to a guy who is looking to get a PC for his son to attend online classes. That just doesn't make sense. For PCIe riser, we often see discussion about the number of capacitors. Old versions of risers would have 4 or 6 capacitors, and nowadays, new version have like 8 or even more capacitors. Now, there are people who say that the more capacitors the riser has, the better. However, some people would also argue that it is just a marketing gimmick like 8 razor blade shavers. I'm not an electronic engineer and I cannot verify or speak for that, but from my experience and also crypto miners around me at least, the number of capacitors does not really matter. If a riser is bound to fail, it will fail regardless of its price or number of capacitors. Just have a couple of extra risers on hand would be fine. The next part about the PCIe riser is more important. I recommend you to get one which supports 6-pin PCIe because that's the primary way that we will be powering the risers. And to me, it is a must-have connector for a riser. Having a 4-pin Molex is also great, and one thing that I would ask you to stay away is SATA. Some risers come with SATA connection. It is fine if your riser has a SATA power connector, but I highly discourage you to power your riser with SATA because it is only rated for a maximum of 54 watts. And your GPU could potentially pull up to 75 watts from the risers. And I have also seen a number of tests done by some experienced crypto miners like Speed Tripping. It is possible for those power-hungry GPU like the RTX 3090 to pull beyond 75 watts from the riser. And if your riser comes with this, the only thing that you should do with it is throwing it away. If the power draw is more than what the connector can supply, you will be lucky if your connector burns and you lose a GPU or the entire rig. But if you are not lucky, you will have to contact your insurance company and make a claim because your house would be on fire. Now you might be wondering, since SATA is not safe to use for powering our risers, then why the risers still come with SATA power connector? Now this is because back then GPUs are not as power hungry and you can use SATA to power your risers if you can confirm that your GPU will not pull more than 54 watts from the pins. But GPU nowadays are getting more and more power hungry. Although you might be using low power GPU for mining, it is still better to be safe than sorry, I would say. When it comes to how much each strand and connector is rated for, I found a lot of different debates, but I will give you a crash course. Based on the ATX standard, our 8-pin connector is rated for 150 watts and 6-pin connector is rated for 75 watts. These are the safe amount of power that it can pull from the strand. However, it is possible to draw more power beyond these numbers. Our standard 8-pin PCIe or VGA strand can supply a maximum of 288 watts per strand, and if you use the 6-pin out of the 8-pin connector, then it will just supply not more than 216 watts. As for Molex connection, the entire peripheral strands can supply a maximum of 156 watts, but how much the Molex connector is rated for is kind of like a debate. According to EVGA's website, both SATA and Molex are rated for just 54 watts, but when I researched more about it, it much depends on your power supply and the wire gauge. If we want to stay at the safest side, powering our risers with 6-pin is definitely going to be the safest, and I never have any issues powering risers with 6-pin connectors. Having said that, I'm also powering a riser for an RTX 3070 with a Molex connector and only using one Molex connector per strand. I would say that the RTX 3070 is the maximum I will go with Molex as far as a riser is concerned, and the caveat is that I'm mining with a non-core intensive algorithm which is not power hungry, and I'm using only the original cable that comes with the power supply, which is usually good in quality as compared to those splitters or aftermarket cables. But again, use 6-pin to power your riser if you can. Molex is good for powering fans. Now, since we are using a riser for every single GPU we want to rig up, we need more PCIe connectors to power the entire mining rig, and it is normal that PCIe connectors that we are supplied by the power supply is not going to be sufficient. The solution for this is going to be PCIe splitters. As the name suggests, a PCIe splitter splits a PCIe connectors into two PCIe connectors. The PCIe connector that we get from a normal ATX power supply is an 8-pin PCIe connector that plugs into the power supply, and another end would be in a form of 6+2-pin or dual 6+2-pin, which is known as daisy chain. So the PCIe splitters that you will need to get is an 8-pin to dual 8-pin splitter. Sometimes the sellers would also call it an 8-pin to a dual 6+2-pin PCIe splitter, just for you know. As for the splitters, get the highest quality you can. The lower the gauge number or AWG, the thicker the wire is going to be, so the better. The minimum would be 18 gauge cable. So if you can get PCIe splitters which use 16 gauge cables, then that would be the best. However, in my country, I couldn't get any splitters with 16 gauge cables unless I go for custom made. So 18 gauge cable is good enough, and based on my experience, they are fine as long as we use these splitters in moderation, which means for GPUs that are notorious for pulling a lot of power, especially those GPUs that require 2 8-pins or even 3 8-pin connectors, we do not want to connect all the 8 pins from the splitters. Ideally, we want at least one strand coming directly from the power supply without splitting or daisy chain. Anything less than 18 gauge is not recommended. Alright, now let's move on to the two parts that you should never go cheap while you are building your GPU mining rig, and they are the GPU, of course, and also power supply. Alright, so for GPU, I think it is very straightforward because this directly affects your mining profitability, and the reasons why you want to save money on other parts as much as we could is because we want to spend more on GPU, which is the assets that produce the revenue for us. When it comes to GPU selections, there are two aspects that you need to know, and they are dollar per hash and also hash per watt, which is known as efficiency. Now, dollar per hash refers to how much you are paying for every single mega hash or solutions, depending on which algorithm you are referencing to. To get your dollar per hash, simply take the price of the GPU, divide by the hash rate that you can conservatively get from that particular single GPU. The lower the dollar per hash, the better, as it means that you are paying less for every single hash rate. The next aspect is hash per watt or efficiency. It is simply refers to how much hash rate you can get from every single watt of power that the GPU uses. To get the power consumption of the GPU, you can also go to website like whattomine.com and look for the benchmark hash rate for the GPUs you want to buy as well as the wattage. You can also do more research about the hash rate of the GPUs on different algorithms and also the power consumption in order for you to do a thorough comparison before purchasing. As for the design and model for the GPU, different brands will have different cooler and fan designs for the same GPU. Some have a larger heatsink, some have a single fan, some have dual fans, while some have beefy 3 fans. Now, some GPU also come with factory overclock, and the price of such GPUs can sometimes be slightly higher. I would say that this does not matter much because we will be overclocking our GPU anyway. Silicon lottery aside, they are basically made of the same chips and board, so the mining performance is going to be very similar. The only difference between different brands and models will be the cooling performance. Now, this is not really an issue as well because we will be limiting the power or undervolting the GPUs to keep them cooler. Personally, I also have single fan model that runs cooler than a dual fan model. Now, some GPU might run hotter than another due to the heat sinks and fan designs, but I would say that nothing is really going to be like very unmanageable here. Now, back in the days when I just started in GPU mining, we are advised to go for the cheapest model to get faster ROI, which I think is a very logical move because we are venturing into crypto mining. ROI is our primary goal. I would say that this piece of advice is still great, but with an asterisk. Nowadays, as GPU performance is getting better and better, the power consumption also increases, and therefore we have to deal with more heat, especially GPUs that are using the GDDR6X memory, namely the RTX 3070 Ti, 3080, 3080 Ti, and 3090, and now the 3090 Ti. These GPUs are great when it comes to mining performance and density because with a single RTX 3090, for example, you would need 4 GTX 1660 Super or Ti to kind of match the hash rate. So going for a single RTX 3090 would have saved you 3 risers and a couple of splitters, and it would make more sense for miners whereby density is a concern because in this example, assuming every rig has the same number of GPUs, you will need 4 rigs of 1660 Supers or Ti to match the hash power of a single rig of RTX 3090. But before getting into those GPUs, especially those power-hungry GPUs like the one with a GDDR6X memory, I highly recommend you to do a little bit more research and read or watch some reviews from different crypto miners or ask some miners in the mining communities who own the specific model, because some models are notorious for bad thermal performance and the memory junction temperature can go above like 100 degrees Celsius or even 110 degrees Celsius and eventually thermal throttling even when they are brand new. If you happen to get those GPUs that thermal throttles, you have no choice but to disassemble the entire GPU and change the stock thermal pads to better ones. And of course, you will also need to reapply the thermal paste for the GPU when you reassemble the GPU. Now, these are extra steps and also extra costs for us miners. And more importantly, it voids your warranty. Now, it is normal for GPUs to get hotter over time as the thermal compound and pads will degrade over time. This is a part of a mining hardware maintenance as well, but usually this would only be needed after a couple of years, whereby it is already past the warranty period of the GPUs anyway. But if you are getting new GPUs that thermal throttles right out of the box or after a few weeks and months, it is not going to be the end of the world, but I just don't think that it is going to be a good experience either. So before buying those GPUs, do a little bit of research because there are some models that are notorious for thermal issues. Enough discussion on the GPU, now let's move on to another important component of your rig, which is often being neglected, and that's the power supply. The power supply is the component that sends all the necessary power to every single other component in your entire system, including your GPU. So investing in a great power supply is pretty much essential, as not only it protects your GPU, great and efficient power supply will also save you some electricity costs. So let me begin with the least important about power supply first. Now, it's least important but still important, alright? Power supply comes in modular, which is this one, and also non-modular variant. Now, it will be easier for you to cable manage with modular power supply because you do not have to plug in strands that are not being used. It also looks better in general as the cables are black color. Now, non-modular power supply would have all the available cables attached to it, so even if you are not using certain strands, you have to deal with the cable as well. But of course, it is usually more budget friendly. Having said that, high-end power supply are usually non-modular, especially when you go above 1000 watt and above, right? Like this one. The second thing to discuss would be the types of power supply. For all my builds, I go with standard ATX power supply because they can be installed onto the mining rig frames. There is no need for small form factor power supplies here, as you are going to pay more for no actual benefits apart from it looks cute. But a cute power supply in a massive rigs like this one is going to look ridiculous anyway. You might also see some miners use server style power supply which are more durable because they are meant to run 24/7. However, it can be a little bit more intimidating if this is your first time building your own GPU mining rig, because you have to find other parts like the breakout board and suitable cables for you to power your rig. Also, it can be a little noisier and runs hotter compared to standard normal ATX power supply, but they are cheaper and more efficient most of the time. Speaking about efficiency, that's the next thing that we have to discuss, and it is very important starting from here. Now, every power supply has its own efficiency rating. The efficiency rating is simply the power output to those components divided by the actual power drawn from the wall socket. For example, if your PC is consuming 500 watts and if your power supply has a 50% efficiency rating, it would draw up to 1000 watts from the wall. So you might ask, where the other 500 watts go? Well, the other 500 watts are wasted in a form of heat in that process. You will see an 80 plus badge for your power supply. That's a certification designed to denote that a power supply is at least 80% efficient at 20%, 50% and 100% loads. You will also see a certification comes in different color, and these are the efficiency ratings from the least efficient to the most efficient: bronze, silver, gold, platinum and titanium. The more efficient the power supply is, the less you would have to pay for electricity, because understand that your rig is running 24/7. So a little more efficiency will have a significant impact over the long run. Also, the more efficient the power supply is, the less heat it will generate and the better its longevity and reliability. For mining, I would highly suggest you to go with 80 plus gold at least. So done with the efficiency, let's talk about the capacity. Now, this is usually the first thing most people would look at while choosing a power supply, well, because it is usually written like very big on the box of the power supply itself. So now, of course, capacity of your power supply is important, or I should say the most important, but here I would like to share with you how to choose the capacity that your mining rig needs. When it comes to electricity or power consumption, there is one rule called 80% rule, which simply means you only want to use 80% of what the component is rated or designed for. So for example, you wouldn't want to use 1000 watt out of 1000 watt power supply. That's going to make you calling your insurance company again. So for a 1000 watt power supply, you only want to use 80% of it, which is 800 watts. So I have a 750 watts power supply here. As you can see, it says 750. So the safe amount of power to be used is about 600 watt for this power supply. Now, after knowing this 80% rule, we need to know how much our mining rig can potentially consume. Now, for example, a GTX 1660 Super will consume around like 70 over watts to up to 85 watts mining Ethereum. So if you have 6 units of 1660 Supers mining Ethereum, the GPU will draw around 500 watts and your system will draw another 30 to 50 watts. So you might think that it is safe to power that rig with this 750 watts power supply. Now, it is safe to use this 750 watts power supply for this rig with the caveat that your overclock and undervolt settings do not reset. Especially if you are mining with Windows, it is notorious for your settings to be reset when you add more GPUs into the system. So when your undervolt settings is being reset, a single 1660 Super can consume about 120 to 125 watts at stock settings. And right now, your 6 GPUs will consume 750 watts plus another 30 to 50 watts for the system, which totally exceed the capacity of this power supply right over here. So to safely and properly plan out the total capacity required for your rig, I highly suggest you to look at the TDP or thermal design power of your GPU, as this would be the amount of power that your GPUs could potentially draw if your undervolts or power limit settings are reset due to whatever reasons like overclocks that are unstable. And so for the 6x1660 Super rig, you will need a capacity of 1000 watt to run this entire rig without any worries, which means if the overclock and undervolt resets, you are going to be fine. Now, you can use a single 1000 watt power supply, but sometimes you might want to do a little bit more research and survey of the price first, because it might be cheaper for you to get 2 power supplies instead. In my region, with the price of a single 1000 watt 80 plus gold rated modular power supply, I could get 2 units of 650 watts 80 plus gold rated modular power supply with about like $18 more. Same brand in case you are curious. So in this case, I would go for 2 units of 650 watts power supplies instead, especially if you are in a budget, okay? Because it gives you more capacity with similar amount of money. So higher capacity is also a future proof as well for future expansion. Now, if you are powering a single rig with more than 1 power supply, there is something that you need to know about powering the rig. An ATX power supply will only turn on when the 24-pin cable is plugged into the motherboard. Now, if you are using 2 power supplies or more to power a single rig, your primary power supply would be the one that is powering the motherboard and your system, while the secondary power supply would be powering a couple of other GPUs. If you go and turn on the secondary power supply or any additional power supply that is not plugged into the motherboard, your power supply will not be turned on. To solve this issue, there are 2 safe ways of doing it. The first way is to use the jumper that comes with your power supply. Now, not all power supply comes with the jumper, but some do. Now, this thing basically tricks the power supply by shorting the 2 required pins and jumpstart the power supply. This is included in some power supplies for PC builders to test certain components without connecting to the motherboard. If you are using this jumper for your secondary power supply, every time you turn on your rig, you will have to turn on the secondary power supply first before turning on the primary power supply that is powering the motherboard and boot into the system. If you boot into the system first before turning on the secondary power supply, then your system might not detect the GPUs that are being powered by the secondary power supplies. The second way is to get a power supply splitter that looks like this. Now, this connector with only 2 cables, okay, work like the jumper. So what you need to do is just plugging in your power supply and then you turn on your entire mining rig by turning on the system. So that's pretty much the information that you will need when it comes to choosing parts for your mining rig build. Now, before wrapping up this video, I want to share with you an additional tip about power supply selection, and based on my experience that I think not enough people are talking about. And that's the number of available PCIe, or sometimes known as VGA power connectors that you can use, and also the types and number of cables that you are given by the manufacturers when you purchase the power supply. Now let me explain a little bit further and also give you some practical examples. Let's say I'm getting a 1000 watt power supply, and with the 80% rule, I can safely use up to 800 watts for this 1000 watt power supply. Now this allows me to power 6 GTX 1660 Supers or Ti that have a TDP of 120 to 130 watts in a single rig together with the system, or maybe 3 RTX 3070 Ti that has a TDP of 290 watts each, but of course with proper undervolting and without, powering the system. However, when you really get into the power supply, when you really get the power supply on hand, you will realize another issue, and I hope someone would have told me earlier about this. For example, if you get a power supply like the Gigabyte 1000 watts, you will have 5 CPU or PCIe ports on the power supply, and when you check the cables given, you will find 2 strands for CPU and 3 strands of PCIe. Now, each 8-pin PCIe strand can only deliver a maximum of 288 watts per strand, and with an 80% rule, it is only safe to use about 330 watts, and that's 330 watts per strand. And the 2 8-pins from a daisy chain will also share the same power because they are coming from the same strand. To power a 1660 Super or Ti safely, you will need at least 1 strand of PCIe with a splitter. Now, I know that you can definitely power 2 1660 Supers or Ti with the risers by using 2 splitters on a daisy chain, and you can mine Ethereum as they only consume like around 80 watts each, and each strand is good for at least 200 watts, I would say. It is still unsafe to do so. Now, you will need to make sure your undervolt or power limit settings will not be reset, and your setup is definitely not ready for power-hungry algorithms like Kapow. Now, you can purchase an aftermarket 8-pin PCIe strand since your mining rig's CPU would probably only need 1 CPU strand, and you would have 1 additional 8-pin port on the power supply. So this would be an additional cost nonetheless. If you want to power 3 3070 Ti's with this kind of power supply, I would say that it is quite impossible to do it safely, because for GPU that requires 2 8-pins, you need 2 strands for a single GPU. 1 strand goes directly from the power supply to your GPU, while another strand will be splitted. One end will be going into the GPU and another 6-pin for the riser. Since you can only have a maximum of 4 PCIe strands for this PSU, powering 3 3070 Ti's would be impossible even though you have enough capacity to do so. Now, if you get the 1000 watt 80 plus gold rated power supply from EVGA, you can instantly tell the difference. On EVGA's 1000 watt power supply, you get 2 dedicated 8-pin ports for CPU and 6 8-pin VGA ports for your GPU. In the box, you will find 4 strands of 8-pin to 8-pin PCIe strands and also 2 strands of daisy chains, which are the one whereby you have 2 sets of 6+2 pins at the end. So right off the bat, you only need 6 splitters and you are ready to go. For a 6x1660 Super or Ti rig, you can run 1 PCIe strand per GPU. Now with a splitter, one end of the 8-pin will be going into the GPU and another 6-pin will be going into the riser, and you are done. For 3 units of 3070 Ti's, you will need 2 PCIe strands per GPU with a splitter. Now 1 strand goes directly from the power supply to the GPU, while the second strand would need a splitter. So here's a tip for you. Check the number of available ports and also cables that you get before buying the power supply. Now, personally, I'm a fan of EVGA's power supply. You will always get a little bit more ports, extra ports and enough cables compared to most brands out there if we compare the same capacity from EVGA and also other brands. And I've been using their power supply for a long time without any problems as well. Also, their cables are usually quite premium compared to a lot of brands out there, especially those that are cheaper in price. Of course, this is not sponsored by EVGA, I just genuinely like their products. So that will be all for this video, the parts guide for building a GPU mining rig. I'm working on the next video on how to build a GPU mining rig, which covers the step-by-step process of building up your first GPU mining rig. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you want to see that video, and also turn on the notification if you do not want to miss out. Alright, so that's all for this video. Hope you find it useful, and I will see you when I see you. Peace out.